Good morning. We're on the Chulin Daf Yomi Aleph 55a, about halfway down. It says Nittel Atchol, if the spleen was removed. Rav Avira Mishmei de Rava. Rav Avira Mishmei de Rava. Rav Avira quoted Rava, and Rav Avira quoted Rava, and he said, "Lo shanu ela nittel." That we're talking. The only problem is when there's the spleen. Sorry, Nittel Atchol, we had in our Mishnah, it said we had a list of the kosher things, and if the spleen was removed, that's going to be okay. It is kosher. Amar Ravira Mishmei de Rava. Ravira said, he quoted Rava saying, Lo shanu ella nittel aval nikav treifa. That's only when it was removed. But if it's punctured, if it has a puncture, that's going to be treif. Maser Rav Yossi bar Oven v'teimer Rav Yossi bar Zvida chotech m'uber sheb'mea mutter. If someone cuts out a fetus from inside the inside of an animal, mutter. Ba'achila, you're allowed to eat it. Minat cholim in a place. If someone cuts off of an animal's spleen or kidneys while it's still alive, asur ba'achila, you cannot eat it because it's ever minachai. You cannot eat it even after the animal's died. That is shechted, it's slaughtered. Ha beheim begufa, but the Gemara understands so there. That if you cut it while it's still alive, you can't eat the animal. You can't eat the kidney, but you could eat the animal. You can't eat these organs, but the animal itself is still good, even though you cut off part of the kidneys and the spleen. The behemoth itself, the animal itself, would be okay to eat, even though there's punctures and there's cuts in the spleen. So Gemara says, no, that's not a proof. Really, even an animal is also forbidden. Even the animal itself is also forbidden once there's cuts in the spleen and the kidneys. And since in the beginning it starts off saying it's permitted to eat, in other words, which we're comparing it to something that when you cut out the fetus that's still inside, when it's after you shech the animal, it's permitted to eat. Therefore, in the end, we say asur. Even though it's not only the spleen that's asur, but it's also the animal itself that's asur. Since the animal has a spleen that's cut, and that would render the whole animal unfit. Or you could say that maybe if it's cut, it's a problem. But if it's cut, it's not a problem. That's how we deduce from it before, that if it's cut, you would be able to eat the rest of the animal. But if it's punctured, that's going to be a problem. In other words, there's a difference between punctured and cut. Nitlo akleis, that's viba sema, or you could say nikav lachud. If punctured has one rule, and if it's cut, has a different rule. Fine. The next Gemara quotes the part of the mission that says nitlo akleis. If the kidneys were removed, it's still going to be a kosher. So they're going to be okay. Amar Rachish bar Papa Mishmei de Rav. Rachish bar Papa quotes Rav saying, "Laksa bekul yachas." If it had that disease in one of the kidneys, treifa is treifa. Amri b'marava. So they said, the people in the West in Eretz Yisrael said, lakusa lamakam charitz. This disease has to reach the point of there's like an indentation. There's where the kidney goes in that area has to have disease also in order for it to be not good. Makam charitz. Where is the area? Where is the indentation area? Lechivra the tuse masne. That's the white part. The white part in the kidney. So I asked all the people in the Ma'arif in the West, all the people that paskin and treifa shelas, the people that answered such questions of whether animals are disqualified, but with these cases or not. And they told me we rule like Rachish bar Papa, that in this case that it's a disease can be a problem when it reaches the charitz, the indentation. Right. But the halacha is not like Rav Avira that we just said. Now we quoted Rav Avira that when there's a puncture in the spleen, it's going to be a problem. So we don't rule like that. When there's a puncture in the spleen, he's saying it will not be a problem. But then we add on that Rav Avira nami lo amarnel b'kulshay. But that's only by the thin part. Basically, the spleen is shaped like a tongue, and there's a thicker part and a thinner part. So on the thicker part, on the thinner part, we don't rule like Avira, and therefore puncture will not be a problem. But in the thick part, a puncture will be a problem. Treifa. And if there's a thickness of a dinar zav, that's a certain coin, if there's thickness, size of the thickness of that coin, kshera, if it's still going to be kosher, even though there's a puncture all the way through, besides for that thickness, it's still going to be kosher. And that's actually how we rule in Shulchan Aruch. The actual halacha is that if there's a puncture in the thin part, it's going to be okay. If there's a puncture in the thick part, it's a problem unless it leaves over a thickness of a dinar zav, this coin called a golden dinar. Amr b'marava. So the people in the Marava said a rule: kol apostle b'reya, whatever disqualifies a lung kosher b'kolya is going to be kosher by a kidney. Sherenekev, how do we see that? Because the puncture apostle b'reya disqualifies a lung, the kosher b'kolya, and it's kosher by a kidney. V'chol shekain echad the kosher b'reya, kosher b'kolya, and definitely when something's kosher by a lung, it's definitely kosher by a kidney. Maskav of Tanchum asked Beklalu, is this a general rule that everything that's kosher by a lung is kosher by a kidney? Very mugla, we have a blister with pus. The kosher by it is kosher by real possible kolya, and it's possible in a kolya, in a kidney, because it shows decay. Very maim zakin, and then there's the case of clear liquids, of a blister with clear liquids, dikshir hacha. That's technically kosher in both places. So Rashi says he doesn't know what the question of Mayim Zakin with clear water is. Tosfos seems to try to explain it, that Mayim Zakin, a blister Mayim Zakin with clear water, does indicate decay, and therefore it should be a problem by a kidney, even though by a lung it's okay. So how can we compare them? Ella Amar of Rashi, and therefore Rashi says we don't go with these rules. Rather, Treifus coming down. So the other, you're comparing Treifus, one disqualification to another. Ein Omer b'Treifus zodam lazo. We don't say in Treifus, we don't compare one to another one. Because you can cut it in one area and it'll die. You cut it in another area and it will live. What this is referring to is on the back legs. There's a certain area in the Thomas Agiden where the Giden, the sinews join together, and if you cut that, that's going to say it's treif. But if you cut the meat higher than that, it's still going to be kosher. So you see that even though something might be closer to the body, you might think it's more of a chance for it to disqualify the animal. It's not necessarily so, because every part of the animal has different properties and different ways it grows and functions, and therefore you can't learn out from the disqualifications of one organ to another. And also when we said clear water is clear liquids, and the blister is going to be kosher. Lo amar and older tzile. We only said when it's clear water lachiri, but if it's a little dirty, treifa, it's going to be treif, disqualified. And when it's clear, that's only when it's not rotted. It's not, what's the word? It's not smelly. It's not a bad liquid. It's not like a rotten liquid, even though it's clear. But if it is treifa, then it's going to be disqualified. A kidney that got very small, it shrunk. Bidaka, so there has to be a certain size. Bidaka, by a small animal like lambs or sheep and goat. Adkepol, up until it gets a bean size, it's still kosher. Small, and that is a problem. Bigasa, if it's a large animal like a cow, adkanava beinanis, up until an average size grape. If it's that small, then it's still kosher. If it's up until that size, it's kosher. It's smaller than that, is going to be a problem. So the back of the Mishnah said another, if the lower jaw is missing, is removed from the animal, it's still kosher. Amar of Zera. Of Zera said, Lo shanu el sheyecholo lichios al yidei liita. That's only as long as you can feed it, you can stuff it and feed it, because it cannot chew. So you have to be able to feed it. Amra. Liita of Amra is different types of force feeding the animals. But if it cannot live even through force feeding, treif, then it's going to be disqualified, because if it can't eat, it can't live. Then the Mishnah said, Nitla aim shalaf. The uterus was removed. It's not going to be disqualified. It's still kosher. Tanahia aim, he tarpachas, he shalpuchas. The three different words for the same thing. The aim, the tarpachas, and the shalpuchas. They all refer to the uterus. The charusa bidei shamayim kishera. If a lung shrunk because it was something like it got scared from lightning, thunder, lightning, or something like that. Bidei shamayim. In other words, not by human. It wasn't scared by humans, but rather by nature. it's going to be kosher. Taner ban ezi charusa. What's considered a charusa? Kol shetzamka re'eh, whatever the lungs shrunk, bidei shamayim, through natural ways, kshera. Then it's going to be kosher. Bidei adam, but if it's caused by a person, treifa, then it's not good. Rabbi Shimon Elazar mar'af bidei kol abrius. Rabbi Shimon Elazar says even if it happened through any of the abrius, any of the animals or stuff like that, if the, let's say, a lion roared and scared and its lung shrunk, also. So we're going to see what also means. Is it included in the first case that it's kosher or the second case that it's not kosher? And that's the next question. Rav Shimon Elazar says that the kol abrius, that all the other animals, if it's scared by all the other animals, it's the same rule as before. Is he going aresha on bidei shamayim, on a natural way, and that's considered, and it's going to be kosher? Or is he going in the reisha and sakula? Oh, asefika, or maybe he's going in the end, and it's going in the same case as bidei adam, through a person that a person scared, and it's going to be lechumra. Tashima. We're going to bring a raya charusa b'dei adam treifa. If it's charusa, if it's shrunk b'dei adam through a person, treifa, it's going to be disqualified. Rav Shimon Elazar Omer af b'dei kol abrius. Rav Shimon Elazar says in that charusa b'dei shamayim, charusa b'dei brius is like charusa b'dei adam. He adds right onto the way of Bryce that clearly said it's just like b'dei adam. That if a lion roars and its lungs shrink, it would be disqualified, just like the case is in if a person scared it. Actually, in the Shulchan Aruch and the Halacha, we rule that if it's scared by any of the animals, it's going to be just like it's bidei shemayim, and it's going to be kosher, which seems to contradict our Gemara right here, because over here it says clearly, Rav Shimon Elazar said even bidei abrius is like bidei adam. So the Beis Yosef they explain that this is because Rav Shimon Elazar is arguing on the first Tana, the main Tana. He's clearly disagreeing with someone, and we usually paskin like the stam, the first one. Now, when there's a machlokas and there's a one that's without a name, one with a name, we paskin like the first one. And in this case, he argues on it, so that we should imply that the first one feels that charusa bidei abrius is like bidei adam, because he's saying that he are disagreeing and saying that it's like bidei adam. So that indicates that the Tanakama holds that it would be like bidei shamayim and it would be kosher. And examples of bidei adam would be, let's say, if someone would slaughter with shech other animals in front of another, in front of an animal, and that animal could get scared, and that's considered charusa bidei adam. That's why one's not supposed to shecht animals in front of other animals, ideally, so they shouldn't get scared. Also, it's sar b'leichaim. It's painful for the animals to watch it, so therefore, that's another reason why they shouldn't slaughter things in front of other animals. It's considered painful for the animals. Okay, Rabbi Bar Chana Kavakazil b'Madbura. Rabbi Bar Chana was going in the desert. Ashkach, he found Hanu Dichre. He found rams that some Agredi do that. They had their lungs were shriveled or shrunken. Asashol b'Midrash. He went and asked in the base medrash. Amrli b'Kaita. He said, if it's in the summer, I see Meshich lichivri, bring white bins. Umalinu ma'ikri, fill it with cold water, and chinu meis lace, and leave it in there for 24 hours. The hadron barian, if it reverts to its prior state of full long bidei shamayim. That shows that it was bidei shamayim, that it was made through heaven, through nature, like lightning and thunder, and it's kshera, vilo, and if not shreifa, then it's going to be not kosher. Bisitav, if it's in the winter, I see mishich shechuma, bring a black clay, umalinu maya pshurin, and fill it up with lukewarm water. Again, the black absorbs the heat, so that's in the winter. We're trying to get it slightly warmer. We want to keep it at an average temperature. So we're trying to, in the winter, get the hot ones, and in the winter get hot, and in the summer bring cold. So in this case, you bring a black kli, a black utensil, a black bin or vessel or basin. And fill it up with lukewarm water. And leave for 24 hours. And if it returns to its original state, then it's going to be kosher. But if not, if it stays shrunken, then it's going to be not kosher. So the next thing we said in the Mishnah was a machlokas hagluda. If an animal is flayed alive, that's there's an argument about that, whether it's kosher or not. Tanu Rabbanan hagluda Reb Meir machshav chacham poslim. Reb Meir said it's kosher. Chacham say it's not kosher. Vikfar Heid Elazar Safra Yochanan ben Gudguda. We already have the testimony of these two people, Elazar Safra and Yochanan ben Gudguda. Al-Agluda, about that the ruling about a gluda, a skin animal, is that it's psula. Amar Rav Shimon ben Elazar. Rav Shimon ben Elazar said, Chazer bo Rav Meir. Rav Meir retracted from his original position that it's kosher, and now he maintains that it's not kosher. So Mechlal, from the fact that Rav Shimon ben Elazar says Chazer bo, that means he clearly held that at some point they argued. Mechlal de Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Polig. You see clearly that Rav Shimon ben Elazar holds that Polig Rav Meir begluda, that Rav Meir argues in the case of a gluda. He disagrees when it's in the case of a flayed animal and would hold that he would originally hold that it's kosher. Vatanya, but we say we have a brisa. Amar Rav Shimon ben Elazar lo nechlu Rav Meir v'chacham al gluda shepsula. Rav Shimon ben Elazar says that Rav Meir never doesn't argue that a gluda, that a flayed animal is kosher. That seems to be a contradiction in words of Rav Elazar. First he says he retracted, then he says he doesn't argue. Doesn't argue implies that he never argued. This is part of the statement. He was Roshia, was the son of Yehuda, and he said in front of Rabbi Kiva, Mishum Rabbi Tarfon, ala gluda shepsula, that we rule by a gluda that it's disqualified, and because he said Rameir never argued. Vim nishtar bo kasela, and if there was remaining an area of a sela is a coin, a size of that sela in an area covering a certain area, then it's going to be kosher. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak lo nechlaku lo amad Rameir mamachlakasa. So we're going to answer the contradiction in the words of Shimon Elazar, that in one case he said he retracted, in another case he said he didn't argue. That what does he mean by they didn't argue? He didn't remain in his argument. In other words, he originally argued, but he didn't stay that way, and now he doesn't argue anymore. That's what Shimon Elazar meant to say. Amar Mar. We just mentioned earlier that if this sela coin size remains, the area that skin remains, that's still kosher. Heicha. So where does that sela coin size have to be in order for it still to save the animal to be considered kosher? Amar Vida Marshmal al Panei Hashed Rekula. It has to be along the spine. Ibai Lahu the Arach of a cotton doesn't mean that it's a long thin strip. The Chim Etzarflu, that when you combine it have a gesela. And in other words, if the whole thing altogether is going to be a sela coin size. Odilma Baruch of Sela Panei Hashed Rekula. Or maybe it has to be the thickness of a sela coin along the whole length of the spine. Tashima. I'll bring a proof to one way or the other. The Parsha of Nerai Mishmei Shmuel. Baruch of Sela Panei Hashed Rekula. It has to be the width of a sela coin along the length of the whole shedra. Rabba Bar Bachana Amar. Roshe Prakim. In other words, all the joints. It has to cover all the joints. Rabbi Lazar ben Antigonus Mishum Rabbi Lazar Rabbi Yani Amar Makim Tibur. It has to be in the navel area. That's where the skin has to be in order to save on the rest of the animal. Let's say the whole animal has its skin on, except the area of the spine is missing the skin. Nitl Makim Tibur, or the place of the navel is missing. The rest of it's still around. Nitl Rashi Prakim, or let's say they cover the joints. The skin around the joints area is removed. The kulakaim, the rest of it's still there. By take. So that remains a question. We did not answer that question. Amar Rav. Next name is Rav says Kola Arkula Matzul Begluda. Any skin can save by gluda. Wherever you have a sela size, they can. Rav saying anywhere in the animal that has a sela coin size area skin, it can save chutz mi'arbes parses, except for the skin on the area of the bottom joint of the legs. The Rabbi Yehuda Omar Filo Arbes Parsis, even that area, the skin of that area can be included. Nami Matzul can also save if you have a sela coin size in that area, it can still save it. Bamini Rav Asi Mer Yochanan, Rav Asi asked Rabbi Yochanan, Arbes Parsis Maushi Yatzel Begluda. So Rabbi Yochanan said it, but I guess he didn't hear it. He's asking Rabbi Yochanan, will the area of this bottom joint save it? The skin on the area of the bottom joint save the animal from being considered a gluda and being not kosher? Amalei Matzul, he said, yeah, it works, it saves it. Amalei, so you ask him, how can you say that? Lima Taner Rabbeinu, we said, Elu Shar Sam Kivsaran. There are certain things that it has, the skins have the same rule as the meat. Certain areas in the animal. Elu Shar Sam Kivsaran, Arbes the process, that area above the bottom joint, the skin is like the meat, and if the skin's like the meat, it cannot save in the rest of the animal because it's just considered meat, not skin. He said, don't upset me with that question. Why? Because that statement that the skin of that area is considered like the meat and wouldn't save as skin is only an opinion of one Tana. It's not like the majority. It's a minority opinion. So I learned that Mishnah in a lot in the term in that it's a singular one singular Tana, and the majority disagree with him. The Tanya, Hashocher Zola, when it slaughters a carbon ola, an ola carbon. So when one makes a sacrifice, he has to intend that it should be brought on the mizbech, it should be brought on the altar, and it should be brought. And you can't have in mind that it should be brought outside of the proper time. And every sacrifice has a certain amount of time that it can be eaten, and a certain area in which it can be eaten. So if a Kohen, if the one that's slaughtering the animal has in mind that it should be either eaten outside this area or it should be eaten after the time that it's allowed to be eaten, that can disqualify the animal. But when he's having in mind to eat a certain part of the animal outside of the time, it has to be part of the animal that can be eaten, that is considered meat, in order for it to be considered pigul. In other words, there's two levels. If I have in mind to be outside the place, then it's going to be considered just disqualified. But if he has in mind that it should be eaten outside the time, beyond the time that it's allowed to be eaten, it's called pigul, and that's much stricter. So in order for it to be considered pigul, you have to actually have in mind to eat a part that can be eaten. So Hashochet is the Ola, one who slaughters this Ola sacrifice. You want to offer a kazayis of the skin under the tail, outside the place where you're allowed to sacrifice. If you want to do it outside the time frame, pigul v'chayav of course, it is considered pigul, and you're obligated. He gets the karis, which is a very strict punishment for that. Eliezer ben Yehuda Ishay Valim Amar Mishum. So then that's the first Tana. Then the second Tana, which is the minority opinion, says Eliezer ben Yehuda Ishay Valim Amar. He said Mishum Reb Yaakov v'cheinei Reb Shimon ben Yehuda, and so to Reb Shimon ben Yehuda would say as well. Omer Mishum Reb Shimon. He would quote Reb Shimon as saying it. Echad or beis aparsus, whether it's the skin of the bottom joint, vechad or rosh shel egel orach, or whether it's the skin of the head of a young calf, or whether it's the skin under the fatty tail, and anything that the chum said, that the rabbi said by tuma, that or same kifsaron, that their skin is like their meat, lahavi or beisaboshes, and we're including the skin of the private areas. If you have in mind to do it outside of the place, if you have in mind to offer it outside of the place, pasul makaris, it's considered disqualified, and there's no karis, because this is only chutz l'koma outside the time frame. Chutz zman, if you intend to do it that's only outside the place. Outside the place is pasul, is only disqualified, but there's no karis punishment. Chutz zman, but if it's outside the time frame, in other words, beyond the time you're allowed to do it, pigul is considered pigul. It's called pigul. Chayav of karis, and he gets the punishment of karis, the strict punishment of karis. But we see from here that he said, he's the one, this minority opinion is the one that said that by tuma, that the skin is like the meat. In other words, he's the minority opinion that the parsus, the skin of the area of the bottom joint, is considered, the flesh is like the meat, because he said that specifically. Or beis parsus, the skin of the area of the bottom joint, is included in what the rabbi said is the skin is like the meat, and therefore everyone else would hold the skin of that area is not considered like the meat, and therefore it would save, if you have a coin-sized skin in that area, it would save the rest of the animal, according to Rabbi Yochanan, to be kosher. Okay, that's all the treifas, the disqualifications of animals. Now we're going to introduce disqualifications that are unique to birds. Masnisin, they're starting the Mishnah that says Elu treifas both. These are disqualifications in the bird. If there's a puncture in the veshet, in the kuvas veshet, upsukas hagageres, or there's an area that's cut off, an area that's cut in the trachea. Hiksa chuldal rosha, or if a weasel hit it on its head. Malkum shows us a treif, an area that would make it render a treif. Nikava korkavan, or if the gizzard was punctured. Nikva dakin, if the small intestines were punctured. Nafla, or if it fell into the fire. V'nechmer b'nei me'ah, and its intestines got burned. Imirokim psulim, if they're green, it's pasul. Adom ksher, if they're red, it's kosher. Yeah, the Gemara is going to explain that that Yerokim Psul means if things that are supposed to be red change to green, it's going to be disqualified. Things that are green and it's supposed to be green that change to red, it's going to be disqualified. In other words, anything that changes from its natural color after it got burned, that's going to indicate problems and be disqualified. Darsa b'tarfa b'kosel, if it got trampled on or was hit against the wall, or shritzatz the behemam, or an animal trampled it, umefarkeses, and it's still alive to some extent, it's still moving, v'shas the mace lace, and it lasted for 24 hours, v'shachet, and then he shechted, and then he slaughtered it, it's going to be kosher. So let's say it was, one of the cases was hiksa chuld al rosh, if a weasel hit it on its head, attacked it on its head. So Rav Shmuel, Rav Shmuel and Levi all said to Amri, they said you can check for this. There's a way to check to see if it was actually disqualified. There is machnas yad lefnim. You stick your hand inside the mouth and you hit it. You push up against the palate. And you check if the brain will bubble out, will stick out of the head through the area of the head that was broken, that was damaged. You see clearly the membrane as well was damaged, and that's going to be indicated treifa, disqualification. And if it doesn't come out kshera, why? Because we assume that the membrane is still covering it. But the Gemara asks in that, I understand, according to the opinion that feels that it's only disqualified if both membranes are in other words, there's two membranes around the brain. If both membranes are punctured, then it's a disqualification. If only one membrane is punctured, then it's still going to be kosher. So according to the opinion that says that, I understand, because you're pushing it out and it doesn't come out, that shows that there's at least one membrane covering it. But according to the opinion that says, even if there's only one membrane is punctured, it's still going to be treifa. So even when you do the checking and you see that nothing comes out of the head, we should be concerned. Maybe the upper one got punctured, but the bottom one maybe did not get punctured. Why? Because we see clearly. No, it's a possibility. We would see, even though we don't see anything coming out. Even though we don't see anything coming out, it could still be a treifa because one layer may be still intact. But since the other layer is punctured, it's going to be disqualified. So how can this?
After shchita.
Yeah. So the Gemara answers, if it was true that the upper layer, that the upper membrane was punctured, so the bottom one is a much thinner membrane. So that would have just punctured as well, because it's not strong enough to hold on its own. So you can do the checking, and the checking will either tell you, and the checking, according to this opinion, will show you that it was a treifa, because even though the membrane is intact, once you push it a little, the membrane will break, and then you'll see it. Even though this may cause problems to the first opinion. In other words, if you maintain that it's kosher when one membrane is covering it and you push it out, and then it snaps the second membrane, then it will, in some cases, it might be considered not kosher, even when it actually is kosher. But you're not going to make a mistake the other way. In other words, when the Gemara's maskana, what the Gemara is saying is that according to either opinion, you're not going to think it's kosher when it's actually not kosher. Amr Ziri said, "Ein bedika lechulda." When a weasel attacks a bird, you cannot do this checking. You cannot tell, because you won't be able to tell there's a hole there. Because the teeth are so thin that nothing is going to come out when you do this checking. So the Gemara asks, okay, who cares if its teeth are thin? Something can come out. At least a small area will come out, even though it's thin. No, it's not just that their teeth are thin. It's its teeth are thin and bent one way, so that the hole in the brain, in the skull, and the membrane around the brain are not aligned, and therefore even when you push it in, it's not going to come out. And when Ziri, he traveled to the place in Arda, he told them, what I told you is actually, it's a mistake. When I told you that you cannot check when a weasel attacks it, that was a mistake. However, this is what they said in the name of Reb Shimon Lakish. Botkin l'chulda, we can check for weasel biyad by hand. In other words, the checking that we explained, that you stick your hand into the throat, push it up against the back of the mouth, and you see if it comes out the head. But you cannot check it with a nail. How would you check with a nail? Putting it, in other words, the skull was fractured, and there's an area there of membrane. You run it along the membrane to see if there's any holes in that area. Rabbi Yochanan says, even with a nail, you can check. So this is the same machlokes that they had is the same machlokas, was an earlier machlokas of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia. Chad badik biyada. One of them said you could check by hand, according to the way we explained. Chad badik machta. The other one checked with a needle. And they both held that their opinion was the correct one, and they shouldn't check the other way. Man de badik biyada, the one that checked by hand. Amr le laman de badik machta, told the one that checked with a needle, why are you checking with a needle? Ad masay, until when? At the machala maman shel, you're wasting everyone's money, because when you're checking with a needle, you're running it along the membrane, and it may puncture the membrane. In other words, if you check by hand, so you're not touching the membrane. If it's punctured, it'll open up, it'll come out. If it's not punctured, it won't come out. But you're running a nail against it. It's very likely that it'll puncture the membrane, and it'll be rendered unfit, be rendered trait. So how can you check like that? And the other way, Amr leman de badik machta, the one that checked with a needle, said leman de badik biyada, to the one checked by hand. You're feeding the Jews not kosher food. Nevelas, he said. So this nevela means an animal that died. Really, nevelas, this is not an animal that died. Vashchuta, this is a slaughtered animal. It just had another disqualification. Ela treifa. So the real statement was, why until when? Up to what point are you going to feed them non-kosher animals? In other words, slaughtered animals that have other disqualifications. Shemanik of Krum, maybe the membrane of the brain actually punctured, and you're not going to be able to discern it that well with your checking. This time, so we see from here. There's two opinions. There's Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia. One of them checked by hand, one of them checked with a needle. But we don't know who checks which way. We know it's an argument. We don't know who feels which way. This time, the Gemara is going to try to prove that Rabbi Yehuda, who the badik biyada, that Rabbi Yehuda is the one that checked by hand, the sanya, because we have a brayser. Rabbi Shimon Elazar Omer. Rabbi Shimon Elazar said, Mishum Rabbi Yehuda, Bodkin lechulda. So there's Rabbi Shimon Elazar quoting Rabbi Yehuda, and he says clearly you can check for a weasel. In other words, when a weasel attacked a bird, you can check for this. If the attack punctured the skull, biyad, you can check it by hand of a lobe masmir, but not with a nail. Nishbar etzem, and if the bone broke, if the skull is fractured, even though the membrane was not punctured, it's going to be a problem. This time, so we see clearly that a Yehuda is the one that says you can check by hand. Okay, just one thing. This case of a chuld of a weasel attacking a bird is not the case we had earlier, something called drusa. When the animals are attacking, that's talking about when they're attacked with the claws, and that's a different problem. In other words, over there you're searching for sort of marks of venom or diseases that may have been caused by this attack. Over here, we're not worried about diseases. We're not worried about any type of venom. The weasel bit into it. The only concern would be if it punctured all the way through. In other words, if we have regular disqualification of a puncture through the head and the membranes, however it happened. So when the weasel attacked it, by biting it, there is concern for this, and you have to check. That's what we're talking about. It's not the same case of a drusa.
So how do they check with a needle?
So I'm not totally sure, but the way they seem to be explaining is you run the needle along it, and I guess you see if it catches on a hole. And if it would catch, then that would show that it's a hole. But I'm not exactly sure. I don't know. I've never seen it. Okay, we just said here in this brisa, we quoted Rav Shimon Elazar mentioned in the name of Yehuda that you can check by hand to see if both membranes are punctured, and then we said, but if the skull is fractured and the membranes are still intact, it's not kosher. It's a problem. Hagufa kasha, the Gemara says that's a contradiction. Amr's bodkin l'chul. We said you could check by hand, have a lobe masmer, but not with a nail. Alma isla, because he said there is a way to check it. Vadotani, and then we said right after that, nishbar etzem. If the bone broke, afal pisha lonik of krum shamoach, even though the skull, even though the membrane of the brain is not punctured, it is okay. Alma lesla, because you see once the skull is fractured, is broken, even though the membranes are intact, it's a problem. That's a clear contradiction, outright contradiction to the beginning of this brisa. So the end is talking about the Gemara. The end is talking about marine birds, waterfowl. Whole, but apparently they're a little different. They don't have a membrane around the brain. So Gemara says, does that they actually don't have a membrane? So you mean they don't have no membrane? Ella hold the krum arach. Their membrane is softer than a regular membrane, and therefore it doesn't protect it as much. And therefore, once the skull is broken and there's nothing protecting it but the membrane, it's gonna be ready disqualified. Rav Nachman said to Rav Anan, Mar Amar Shmuel, Mar Samar Amar Shmuel, or Shmuel said that he would check, that Mar would check Badik Biyada, would check by hand, Umachshir, and he would see if it's kosher. And if it was kosher, he'd say it's good. Hunachav number of Badik Biyada Machshir. Also, he would rely on the hand checking. Connect them both, but we learned that Levi said that all the disqualifications that disqualify an animal also disqualify a bird. And in addition, by birds we have nishbar etzem. If the skull broke, even though the membrane is not punctured, is also disqualification. Amarle, similar to the answer we had before. Hahu, the exact answer that we had before actually. Hahu both shalmaim. That's talking about waterfowl. Hov ein lo krum. Since it doesn't membrane. The Gemara again asks, you mean it has no membrane? Since the membrane is thin. That's the answer for that. There was a case of a chicken. That was by Rav Chana. They had a question about it. They sent it to Rav Masna. And what was the case? Nishbaretz, and the skull had been broken. But the membrane had not been punctured yet. The Achshra, and he said it's kosher. But we said that Levi said that all disqualifications disqualify an animal, and a bird has an additional disqualification that of nishbar etzem afal pishalonik of krum shamach, if the skull fractured, even though the membrane did not puncture, it's a problem. Amalei hasan bof shamayim. That's talking about waterfowl. Hold ein lo krum, since it doesn't have a membrane. Ein lo krum salkadayach. You mean it has no krum? It has no membrane at all. Since its membrane is thin. Rav Shezi Badik B'Shem Shur, Rav Shezi would check in the sun. Till now we listed two ways of checking if the membrane was punctured. Number one, through the hand, sticking your finger in the throat and pushing out to see if anything comes out through the skull. Number two, running the needle along the membrane to see if it catches, to see if there's a hole there. And now we have another one. You would check opposite the sun. Mistaklam Yir and Nekev Shar Yafal Dika. You look at again in the sun to see if you could see a hole. Apparently, with the light, with sunlight, it's brighter and it's easier to see. Apparently, Rav Yemer Badik Mayer. Rav Yemer would check with water. And how do you check with water? He would. There's two ways of understanding it. Either he would take all the whole brain out of the out of the membrane through the spinal cord, and pull it all out, and then he'd fill it up with water. And if it would go out through the area if you'd fill it up with water, hold the head upside down, if it would drip out of the area where the bruise was, you'd be able to tell that there was a hole. Another way he explains maybe that he poured water on top of it and see if it leaks out through the bottom. In other words, you leave everything in there, you just pour the water on top of the bruise and see if it leaks in. Or you see if, I think they explained, they see if the water comes out. You pour it in, and then you pour it back out, and see if the water comes out with a little wider. That showed that it went through, and it got a little dirty from the things inside the membrane, the brain inside the membrane, and that would be unfit. That would be not kosher. That was one way checking. Rav Yaakov Bar Yaakov Badik Begila. You check with straw. Begil dechitza, a piece of a stalk of wheat. Rashi explains he did it the same way that they used to check with a nail. He just used a stalk of wheat and apparently would run it along somehow, and you'd be able to tell that whether there was a puncture or not. Omer of Shezi, Hani Avzi, Didan, our geese, Kof Shamaim Dami, they're like waterfowl since they're constantly in the water. Okay, enough lower. If the bird fell into the fire, Omer of Yochanan Mishum of Yossi ben Yoshua, Yochanan quoted of Yossi, son of Yeshua, Shir Yurikasan, Kashir Nekuvasan. How much of an area has to turn green? It's the same area that a puncture, same area as a puncture. Just like if it's punctured any amount, smallest amount can disqualify it. After you custom, so if it turns green, if something that's supposed to be red turns green, also mashu, the amount of an area that has to turn green is a small, any amount. Of Yosef Radio Rav Shimon Levi. Rav Yosef asked Rav Shimon Levi. He was the son of Rav Shimon Levi, and he asked Rav Shimon Levi's father, if the liver, which is supposed to be like a purplish brownish color, it turns green opposite the area that it faces the intestines. Mo, what is the rule over there? Is it disqualified? I'm like Treifa, it is disqualified. But the Gemara asks, the rule by a liver is if the liver is removed, if missing, the majority of the liver is missing, it's still kosher. Even if there's still some, provided there's some liver attached in certain places, but even if the majority is removed, it's kosher. So if the small area of the liver turns green, that should be as if that area is missing, but the rest of it's still intact, and it should be kosher. The answer, since the area opposite the intestines is green, be a dush enough for in such a case we know that it fell into fire. That tells us that it fell into fire, and that the stomachs, even the stomachs, were burned to some extent to get affected by the fire of a treifa, and that's considered treifa. In other words, this liver is not a problem because of the liver. It's a problem because it shows what happened to the intestines. Okay, Rabbi Shimon Levi, he had a chicken. And he sent it to Rabbi Elazar Kappa Beribi, who was a great person. He was one of the greatest in his generation. Amr, that's what Beribi means. Amr Yerukan Havu. He said they were green, v'achshara, and he said it's kosher. So what was green? The intestines were green. Amr Lei, so Vanantanan, he said, he asked, but what do you mean? We learned that Yerukan Psulman green is disqualified. So he answered, Lo Amar Yerukan Psulman, Ela B'korkavan. That is only by the korkim, by the gizzard, which is supposed to be red. The lave with the heart, which is supposed to be red, with covet and the liver, which is a purplish brownish color. Those, when it turns green, it's a problem. But when something's supposed to be green and it turns green, that's not a problem. Tanya Nami Hachi, we learned something similar. With these inner parts of the body, we said that when it turns green is a problem. Which ones? The korkim, the gizzard, the lave with the heart of the covet. Those things, if they turn green, is going to be a problem. Everything else, if it turns green and it's supposed to be green, it's not a problem. It's only if it's an unnatural color. He had a chicken shed to look at Rabavo. He sent it to Rabavo, and he said, this is red. The treifa, and he said it's treif. He said it is a problem. But we said Adom, and we said in the Mishnah that green is not good. Red is good. But here it's red, and so it should be good. No, it's really, what's the rule? Something's supposed to be red that turned green, something green that's supposed to be green that turned red, that's treifa. And lo amar adam, when did he say that red is good? That's only believe korkan of covet, by the heart, the gizzard, and the kidney, and the liver. But by everything else, but then by the intestines, it's not supposed to be red. And if it's green, and if it turns red from its greenish yellowish color, then it's going to be disqualified. Amar Shmuel Barchia Amar Rav Amar of Mani, or Shmuel Barchia quoted of Mani, that if, let's say, they're natural color and Adom and the red, they're supposed to be red in the red, Shariku, and they turned green. They turned an unnatural color, and then V'shalkin, and then he cooked them Chazru V'edimo, and then they turned back to the normal color, the natural color. Kshera, that's kosher. My time at Kutra Albu. We say that it didn't actually get burned. There was maybe some smoke entered them. It wasn't actual damage. It was a temporary thing, and therefore, since we see when you cook it, it turns back to its natural state. It's going to be kosher. Amr Rav Nachman Yitzchak says Af Anan. We also say that Adom and Shaloriku, if it's so to the opposite, if it's still red, if it's natural color, and it did not turn green, V'shalkan, and then you cooked it afterwards, V'horiku, and then it did turn green to non-natural, which is for the parts that it's non-natural color, Treifa, it's disqualified. My time, why? Iglai betayu, because it showed, once we cooked it, it showed that it was actually a problem all the way along. And it wasn't just, it's not an issue that just started. Now it really did get burned, we just didn't know it till we cooked it. Therefore, you shouldn't eat anything unless you cook it, a deep cooking, to tell whether it changed or not. And the Gemara says, Lohi, no, we don't have to worry about that. If we don't see an issue, we don't have to worry that there's an issue. We don't have to go searching for an issue. In other words, we see they look a natural color. As long as you see that it's a natural color, you can eat it however you'd like. You don't have to do this deep cooking just to tell if it's in the tray or not. If it got trampled or was pushed against the wall, Amr Belazar ben Antigonus, or Lazar ben Antigonus said, Mishumar Belazar bar Biyanai, Achazav Achazav. In both these cases, Shricha B'dika, you have to check it. You have to look into it. Even though it lasted for 24 hours, the Mishnah said it lasted 24 hours and you slaughtered it as good, you still have to check. Maybe the spinal cord snapped or something like that. You still have to check it once it has, because it already has a reisa. It has a problem with it. We see a problem, and therefore you have to check in such a case. I guess we'll stop there. Okay, thank you.